The moment I walked through the front door of his parents' house in Oakville, I knew exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. His mother looked at my coat. It was a perfectly decent wool coat from Value Village, which I'd bought specifically for this occasion. And then she looked at me, and something in her expression settled into a kind of polite, practiced disappointment. The kind that takes years to perfect. "So this is her," she said to my boyfriend, not to me. I smiled and held out my hand. "I'm so happy to finally meet you. Connor has told me so much about your home." She shook it briefly, the way you shake hands with someone selling something at your door. I'd known this was coming. I prepared for it. What I hadn't prepared for was how much it would still sting. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part I haven't told anyone. Not my sister. Not my best friend. Not even the therapist I saw for 8 months after my last relationship fell apart. My name is Nora. I'm 31. I work as a software architect for a financial tech company based in Toronto, and I make $14,800 a month after taxes. I own a 2-bedroom condo in Leslieville. I max out my RRSP every year. I drive a 7-year-old Honda Civic not because I can't afford something better, but because I genuinely don't care about cars. From the outside, I don't look like any of that. I wear jeans and flannel. I bring my lunch in a reusable container. My idea of a good Friday night is cooking a big pot of soup and watching something on CBC Gem. I don't wear jewelry except for a small gold stud in each ear that belonged to my grandmother. The last man I was serious about, a guy named Derek, whom I dated for almost 2 years, ended things because, in his words, my career made him feel irrelevant. He said it in the therapy session we tried together near the end. The kind of session where people say the truest things because they've run out of energy to keep protecting themselves. He said he'd never been able to stop thinking about the fact that I made nearly twice what he did. That it changed how he saw himself when he was with me. That he needed to be with someone who needed him more. I wasn't angry at him for saying it. I was just tired. Tired of something I'd had nothing to do with becoming the reason a relationship ended. I took a break from dating after that. 6 months, then 8. Then I stopped counting. I focused on work, on my friendships, on finally repainting the 2nd bedroom. And then, at a trivia night at a bar on Queen Street last October, I met Connor. He was on the team next to mine. He argued, very confidently and very incorrectly, that the capital of Australia was Sydney. I leaned over and told him it was Canberra. He looked at me like I'd just done something extraordinary. We talked for 3 hours after the trivia ended. He walked me to the streetcar. He texted before I even got home. He was warm and funny and asked questions that felt genuinely curious rather than performative. He worked as a high school history teacher in Scarborough. He coached the junior volleyball team. He drove a 12-year-old Subaru with a broken passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to fix. And somewhere in those first few weeks, before I'd made any conscious decision about it, I just didn't tell him. I didn't lie exactly. I told him I worked in tech. I let him assume the rest. When he picked up the dinner tab, I said thank you and let him. When he suggested cheap eats on date nights, I said I love cheap eats, which was completely true. I still lived in my condo, but I told him I was renting it, which was also technically true. I was renting it to myself. I told myself it wasn't about testing him. It was about not wanting what happened with Derek to happen again. It was about wanting someone to fall in love with me first, before the numbers became part of the picture. But I also knew, if I was being honest, that I was watching. The way he treated the server who got his order wrong, the way he talked about money, not obsessively, but with a kind of grounded practicality I found genuinely attractive. The way he never once made me feel like my contribution to a date was a transaction. By the time he introduced me to his parents 4 months in, I was fairly certain I was in love with him. I was less certain about what happened when I walked through that door in Oakville. His mother's name was Rosalind. His father, Gerald, was quieter, the kind of man who learned a long time ago that it was easier to let the weather pass than to argue with it. They had a house that was immaculate in the way that signals effort, not ease. Everything was slightly too pristine. The throw pillows were arranged in a way that suggested they'd been measured. Connor's older sister, Priya, she'd taken her husband's last name, was there with her husband, a financial analyst named Trevor, who shook my hand for too long and asked me immediately what I did for work. I work in tech, I said. He nodded like this confirmed something. Like IT support? Something like that, I said. Connor put his hand on my back. Nora is being modest. She's a software architect. Oh. Trevor's tone didn't change much. At a startup? Mid-sized company, I said. Based downtown. Rosalind appeared with a tray of what looked like homemade cheese straws and set it down with the precise care of someone who wanted the gesture noticed. Connor tells us you're renting, she said. To me, but also slightly past me. That's right. In Leslieville? Yes. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she smiled, the same smile she'd given me at the door, the polite disappointment one, and offered me a cheese straw. I took it. It was actually very good. Dinner was roast chicken and roasted root vegetables and a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir that Gerald had clearly been instructed to open. The table conversation moved through Connor's volleyball team, Priya and Trevor's recent trip to Portugal, the renovation Rosalind was planning for the mudroom. At some point, the conversation shifted to finances. It happened the way it often does in families with money anxiety, gradually, then all at once. Trevor mentioned something about the housing market. Rosalind mentioned that she'd seen a condo in Connor's neighborhood listed for a lot. Then she turned to me and said pleasantly, I imagine it must be hard, renting in this market, especially on a single income. I felt Connor shift slightly beside me. It has its challenges, I said. That sound again. I just think, and I say this with the greatest respect, that it's important, when you're in a relationship, to be practical. About the future. About stability. I looked at her. I completely agree. Connor has a pension, she said, as though this information might be news to me, and also might be a warning. Mom, Connor said, quiet and controlled. I'm just saying what's true. You're saying it in a specific way. Rosalind picked up her wine glass. I'm simply saying that the two of you are at different stages of life financially, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Different stages, I repeated. You're renting. He owns. He has a pension, benefits, stability. You work in tech, which is lovely, but volatile. I just want my son to have a partner who can be an equal. The word equal hung in the air. I looked at Connor. He was looking at his mother with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation in his head, and still wasn't fully prepared for the live version. I prepared for this. I told myself that if something like this happened, I would stay calm and let it move through me like water. I told myself that what Rosalind thought of me, based on my coat and my Honda and my rented condo, was not a reflection of my value as a person or a partner. But sitting there at that table, under the light of the chandelier that I suspected had been installed specifically to signal that Rosalind's taste was not something you questioned, I felt something much older than calm. I felt the specific exhaustion of being assessed and found wanting by someone who had not asked a single question about who I actually was, so I did something I hadn't planned to do. Can I ask you something? I said to Rosalind. She smiled her measured smile. Of course. What would make me an equal in your view? She paused. Stability. Security. The ability to contribute to a shared future. Financially, you mean? Partly. So if I made more money or owned property, that would change your assessment of me. There was a brief silence. Gerald refilled his wine. Trevor suddenly found something interesting in his roasted carrots. I don't mean it as harshly as you're making it sound, Rosalind said. I don't think you mean it harshly at all, I said. I think you mean it practically. And I respect that you want good things for your son. I do too. She waited. I'm not going to get into specifics tonight, I said. That would feel strange, honestly. But I want you to know that I hear what you're saying, and I'm not offended by it. This was not entirely true, but it was the truest version I could offer. Connor reached over and took my hand under the table. He squeezed it once. We drove home mostly in silence. Not a cold silence, a processing one. The kind that sits between two people who have something to work through and are both mature enough to know this isn't the moment. When we got to my place, he came up. We made tea. I stood at the kitchen counter and he leaned against the opposite one and we looked at each other for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't need to apologize for her." "I know. I'm apologizing anyway." I turned and looked out the kitchen window at the alley behind the building. There was a recycling bin that someone had left out, ordinary and small and completely uninterested in what was happening inside. "Connor," I said, "there's something I need to tell you." He waited. "I haven't lied to you, but I haven't been fully honest either, and I think, after tonight, I think you deserve the full picture." He didn't say anything. He just stayed where he was, very still, in the way of someone who is choosing not to rush whatever is coming. So I told him. I told him about my job, what it actually was, what it actually paid. I told him about the condo, that I owned it, not rented it. I told him about my savings, not in detail, but enough. I told him about Derek, about what he'd said in that therapy office, about the specific way a relationship ending for that reason leaves a mark that doesn't look like anything from the outside but aches when the weather changes. I told him that I hadn't meant to make it a test, that I'd started by just not volunteering the information and then hadn't known how to backtrack. That 4 months in, telling him had started to feel like it would disrupt something I was terrified to lose. He listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, didn't change his posture, didn't check his phone. When I finished, there was a long quiet. Then he said, "You thought I might leave if I found out. I thought there was a chance. Like Derek. Like Derek." He looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked back up at me, and his expression wasn't the one I'd braced for. It wasn't hurt or defensive or the beginning of an argument. It was something more complicated, something that took me a few seconds to read. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't sting a little," he said, "because it does, not the hiding it. I understand why you did that. But the idea that you weren't sure about me, that stings." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I don't want an apology. I want to understand." He pushed off from the counter and sat down at the kitchen table. "Help me understand what I did or didn't do that made you feel like you couldn't tell me." And that was the part that undid me. Not in a falling apart way. In the way a knot undoes when the right amount of gentle pressure is applied in exactly the right place. Because the honest answer was, he hadn't done anything. He had been, from the first night, exactly who he appeared to be. The thing I'd been protecting myself against wasn't him. It was the ghost of someone else, someone I'd still been dragging around without fully realizing it. I sat down across from him and I told him that. We talked for a long time. About Derek. About his mother and what she'd said at dinner, and why it had landed the way it did. About what it felt like for him to be a teacher. A job he loved. A job that mattered. A job the world consistently underpaid and underthanked. And whether any part of him had wondered, before tonight, whether the income gap between us might become a thing. "Honestly," he said, "I'd assumed you did well. You have a good condo. You're clearly skilled at what you do, the way you talk about your work. I could tell you weren't struggling. I just didn't think it was any of my business until you wanted it to be. Your mother clearly thought otherwise." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "My mother thinks a lot of things. Is she always like that? She's been worse." He paused. "She's also, occasionally, been better. She's complicated, and she loves me in a way that sometimes looks like caring about me, and sometimes looks like managing me, and I've been navigating that my whole life." He looked at me steadily. "I want to be clear, what she said at dinner was not okay. I should have cut it off sooner. I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. You don't need Nora. I'm sorry. That's not negotiable." I looked at him. I thought about how rare it was, genuinely rare, to be sitting across from someone who could separate their love for a parent from their recognition of the parent's failings, who could hold both things at once without collapsing one into the other. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "What do we do about the money thing? As a practical matter, between us." "What do you mean?" "I mean, going forward. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide anything. but I also don't want it to become a thing that changes how we are with each other. Do you think it will? He thought about it genuinely. Not for me. But I also can't speak for you. You're the one who's been hurt by it before. I thought about Derek in that therapy office. His voice, careful and exhausted, saying the truest, hardest thing. I thought about how I'd absorbed that truth into myself and carried it forward as a kind of preemptive verdict, applying it to every man who came after, even when it didn't belong. I think, I said slowly, that it only becomes a thing if we let it become a thing. And I don't want to let it. Then we don't, he said simply. That was 8 months ago. His mother and I have a complicated relationship. That's the most accurate way I know how to describe it. She knows now. Connor told her shortly after that night in a conversation I wasn't part of, but that he described to me afterwards in some detail. She was, apparently, initially flustered, then briefly defensive, then quiet in a way that Connor said he hadn't seen from her in a long time. She hasn't exactly apologized. She made what I can only describe as a heavily implied apology the following Christmas, when she pulled me aside in the kitchen and said she hoped I hadn't taken her comments at dinner as a reflection of her feelings about me as a person, only her concerns as a mother, and that she could see Connor was happy, which was what mattered most to her. I told her I appreciated her saying so. Because I did, genuinely. It wasn't the full accounting I might have wanted, but it was something. People are complicated. Rosalind is very complicated, and Connor loves her, and Connor is worth it. I'm not going to pretend I sailed past all of it without a scratch. There are still moments when Rosalind says something with that particular combination of warmth and edge where I feel a small cold thing move through me, and I have to remind myself that she is not the voice of authority on who I am or what I'm worth. I've gotten better at that. I won't say I've perfected it. What I know for certain is this. The night I sat across from Connor at my kitchen table and told him the truth. The whole truth, the numbers and the history and the fear underneath, and watched him choose to stay anyway, not out of surprise at what I had, but out of genuine care for who I was. That was the first time in a long time that I felt completely like myself in a relationship. He still drives the Subaru with the broken mirror. He still coaches volleyball. He makes a batch of chili every Sunday and brings enough for both of us, because he figured out early on that I eat at my desk on Mondays if left to my own devices. He is, in the most uncomplicated and real sense, a good person, and now he knows exactly who he loves. Not a performance, not a simplified version, not the woman I'd edited down to seem safer or smaller or less likely to threaten someone's sense of themselves. Just me and my flannel and my condo I actually own, with my full salary and my full history and every complicated thing I've ever tried to preemptively apologize for by making myself less. He never needed me to be less. I was just too scared to believe that before I showed him everything. I used to think the hardest part of that night in Oakville was sitting at Rosalind's table while she talked about me like I was a liability. Connor hadn't fully accounted for, but looking back now, I think the hardest part was the drive home, sitting in the passenger seat of Connor's Subaru with the broken mirror, knowing I had a choice to make, and that I'd already been delaying it for 4 months. There's a kind of cause and effect to the way things unfold in relationships, and I don't mean it in a mystical sense, I mean it practically. The things we carry forward from old wounds, the ways we preemptively protect ourselves, they don't disappear just because we're with someone new. They sit in the room with us. They shape what we say and what we withhold. And eventually, one way or another, they surface. What I withheld from Connor wasn't just a number. It was trust. And I've thought a lot about what it means to do something like that to someone who has, from the very beginning, given you no reason to. Derek hurt me, and I took that hurt and quietly applied it to a man who had nothing to do with it. That's not smart, and it's not fair. And I knew it even at the time. Knowing something and acting on what you know are two very different things. And I think that gap between understanding and doing is where a lot of us get stuck after we've been let down. What I've come to believe is that real clarity, the kind that actually changes how you move through the world, requires a kind of honesty with yourself first. not self-criticism, not the relentless audit of every choice you've made, just the willingness to look at what you're doing and ask whether it's coming from your values or your fear. Those two things can look almost identical from the inside, which is what makes it hard. Connor is sitting across from me at my kitchen table and asking, genuinely, without anger, what he had done to make me feel like I couldn't tell him was one of the more disorienting moments of my adult life. Because the answer was nothing. He had done nothing. He had shown up consistently and clearly as exactly who he said he was. The failure of nerve was mine, and once I admitted that to myself, something shifted. There's also something I've been thinking about in terms of what it takes to stay present through difficulty rather than managing it from a distance. What I did with Connor, the withholding, the quiet watching, the careful maintenance of a version of myself, was a way of staying in control. It felt like self-protection. It was actually a way of never fully arriving. You can't be known by someone you won't let see you. And you can't build anything real on a foundation of strategic omission, no matter how understandable your reasons. The night I told him everything, I was scared. Not of what he'd do. By then, I trusted him enough to know he wouldn't be cruel. I was scared of being fully seen and having to sit with whatever came next without any buffer. That kind of courage is quiet and unspectacular. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It just feels like deciding, finally, to stop running a version of yourself that was built to survive a different situation entirely. I'm glad I stopped. I'm glad he stayed. And I'm glad that the woman he loves now is actually me.